Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know we're not meant to say that these days, but I'm going to say it anyway. Welcome to our enlightening panel discussion featuring some of the brightest minds who will provide insight into the attempted expansion of the World Health Organization's powers and influence. My name is Alia Bland, and I am one of the co-founders of Reality Check Radio alongside my fellow reformed domestic terrorists Libby and Claire. I'm going to do my best. I need to master the art of the sort of grandmother glasses so I can see you and see what I'm reading. I'm going to do my best to wrangle the discussion here tonight to make sure we stay on track while keeping up with the brainiacs here on stage. Our panellists tonight are leaders in their fields, and I'm sure you're all eager to dive into the discussion of the who and you, exploring agendas, treaties, sovereignty, and more. Let's give a warm round of applause to our distinguished guests, Dr. Ramesh Thakur, Katie Ashby-Koppens, and Dr. David Bell. It's really important for us to outline our reasoning for putting on this event tonight. As a result of the discussion you'll hear here tonight, we hope to arm you with a good understanding of the issues presented by the W.H.O.'s pandemic treaties, the amendments to the international health regulations, and the threats that they pose to our national and individual sovereignty. If we do our job well, you'll leave this hall better able to communicate your concerns effectively with others without going full fire hose. And I'm sure there's a few of us that are guilty of that in the past. The second reason is that we all know that people power creates change. And to generate people power, we must first prioritise increasing public awareness by first educating ourselves so that we can effectively engage in informed and considered discussion and debate on the issues that matter. The more we can spark interest on this topic amongst those around us, the more the word will spread, the more successful we'll be in orchestrating public and political pressure and ultimately driving the action and change that we seek. This is a numbers game. We don't need half of the population speaking out about an issue to trigger a favourable result, but we do need a small and vocal minority spearheading discussion at a grassroots level, and I'm sure that most of you in this room belong to that group. With your family and friends at the library, at the gas station, at the swimming pool, or the supermarket checkout, every conversation counts. Lastly, as many of you already know, at RCR we encourage people to make up their own minds and to avoid blindly following authority or experts without question. I hear somebody didn't turn off their mobile. We've all seen too much of that in recent times, so we're not asking you to take everything that you hear here tonight as gospel, but we are tremendously grateful to our guests for flying to little old New Zealand to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Professor Ramesh Thakur and Dr. David Bell have first-hand experience working inside the very organisations that many of us now find ourselves criticising, opposing and pressuring the government to exercise caution when entering into agreements with or treaties on our behalf. Their understanding and insights into the structure, purpose and operational nature of the United Nations and the World Health Organization is immensely helpful for us to better understand the threat before us. So I hope you've brought your notebooks and a pen to write down all the pearls of wisdom I'm sure you're going to hear tonight. But if you didn't, as you can see, there's cameras everywhere. We are filming this evening and the recording will be available next week, so you can catch the replay then and share it with your friends and family. So now on to the reason we're all here. Enough of me. Let's introduce our guest speakers. And I think you need to get ready for a qualifications download because this is quite full on. Professor Ramesh Thakur is an emeritus professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, the Australian National University, a senior research fellow at the Toda Peace Institute, and a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. His last post post was Director of the Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament at the ANU. He was formerly Senior Vice Rector of the United Nations University and Assistant Secretary-General of the United Nations. He has held full-time academic appointments in Fiji, New Zealand, Canada and Australia, and has been a consultant to the Australian, New Zealand and Norwegian governments on arms control, disarmament and international security issues. He was Editor-in-Chief of Global Governance from 2013 to 2018, and he's lived and worked in New Zealand and has a son who still lives here, I believe, in Dunedin. Professor Thakur has appeared on RCR several times to discuss the global political climate, governmental overreach, and his book, Our Enemy, the Government, for anyone who wants a good read, COVID, and the expansion of abuse of state power. Thank you, Ramesh, for making the trip across the ditch to be with us here this evening. Dr. David Bell is a senior scholar at the Brownstone Institute and is a public health physician and biotech consultant in global health. He is a former medical officer and scientist at the World Health Organization, program head for malaria and febrile diseases at the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics in Geneva, Switzerland, and director of the Global Health Technologies at Intellectual Ventures Global Good Fund in the USA. This week, Dr. Bell and his team at the University of Leeds published a report focused on the cost of pandemic preparedness, which we'll hopefully touch on a little bit later. He has also been a guest on RCR Breakfast multiple times, sharing his thoughts on the WHO, One Health, the pharmaceutical industry and more. We are very grateful that Katie was able to convince him to divert his journey back from Texas to Texas from events in Australia to attend this panel discussion tonight. So welcome, David. Last but not least, our lovely Katie Ashby-Koppens is a legal strategist who has appeared before the United States, Australian and New Zealand governments regarding the WHO pandemic treaty reforms. She is a qualified barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand and currently practices in Australia as a solicitor. Katie has been the driving force behind the creation of dozens of template letters and resources, helping Kiwis navigate the various COVID response mandates and other instances of governmental overreach, as well as heading the team providing free legal support to tens of thousands of New Zealanders through her role as Voices for Freedom's head of legal. She led the creation of the People's Terms, which is an independent, comprehensive and targeted set of terms that fundamentally redefines how the COVID inquiry should operate and what will be reviewed. This People's Terms petition garnered over 33,000 signatures and was presented to the Deputy Prime Minister at Parliament last week. Most recently, Katie has been instrumental in the ongoing GMO case regarding the COVID-19 injectables in Australia. Keen RCR listeners will recognise Katie's voice from our weekly Legal Hub show on the Breakfast program with Paul Brennan. It's always a pleasure to have you back in New Zealand, Katie. Okay, so before we delve into the nuts and bolts of the many reasons why these WHO treaties are a really bad idea, it would be good to first get a handle on the basics. So this question is for you, Dr. Bell. As a former WHO insider of 9 years, can you please give us an overview of the WHO's role and the purpose it is meant to serve before enlightening us as to what is actually unfolding with respect to the influence of other large international organisations and those providing the lion's share of the funding?
Right, yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me here and for Reality Check Radio for bringing me here. There's been a big change in public health, international public health, and this revolves around, particularly around funding. So about 25 years ago, there was a big increase in funding, and particularly private funding from private foundations that we all know, and from corporations. And so public health sort of went from, the London School of Tropical Medicine Hygiene and the Mahidol School and so on, running things, to these big foundations and big public-private partnerships, which was a new concept. So They're based around commodities. We have Unitaid, which is to try to improve marketing of medical commodities. Gavi, which is focused on vaccines. And more recently, CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which was set up at the World Economic Forum in about 2018, with a specific intent of developing vaccines for pandemics. At a time when it was at least, or over a century, about a century since the last pandemic, which was the Spanish flu, when most people died because they didn't have antibiotics and they had secondary infections. So it is a strange thing to start up a multi-billion-dollar organisation specifically for. So over that time also, the World Health Organization changed in a similar way. So it went from essentially core funding, where the W.H.O decided what to do with its money for diseases of high burden when countries ask for help, to a model where about 75% of the funding is specified, which means they have to do what the funder says. So they don't have a bucket of money to work with. They're a conduit for a funder to give money to get a certain job done. And about 20 to 25% of that funding is now private, from private individuals who are heavily invested in pharma, or from pharma corporations. So inevitably, they invest in this because they want something back. So we've seen this change in public health from the core things that we know make a big difference, like sanitation, nutrition, to a very commoditized public health, particularly around vaccines and medicines. And it doesn't mean they are a bad thing, but it has become grossly disproportionate. So with that in mind, we have this increasing emphasis on, which we'll come to later, a very small part of the global health burden, which is epidemics and pandemics. And we can show, and it has been shown that it's a tiny percentage of mortality. People die in the West from heart disease, from obesity, from cancer. They die in low-income countries also from tuberculosis and malaria and that sort of thing. The first outbreak killed as many people in total in the whole world as about 8 hours of tuberculosis. So it gives you an idea of how skewed the emphasis has become. And the reason for this is because you can sell commodities for outbreaks, and you can mandate commodities for outbreaks. So as we saw in COVID, this sort of pharmaceutical industry corporate sector, which is strongly pushing this agenda and funding WHO now, they made literally hundreds of billions of dollars in profit. And that's very hard to not make if you think there's a way to do it. So WHO essentially is a tool. WHO is not trying to take over the world. WHO is a tool of a much bigger problem, which is this huge conflict of interest in public health, which is very much related to a breakdown in the whole idea of conflict of interest and stopping conflict of interest, and also the fact that we have this huge inequality. So we have individuals who have personal wealth bigger than many countries, and so can have this huge influence on something as important as this. And lastly, the workforce is going along with this because this is where the money is. These people want salaries, they want the benefits that come with it, they need the health care, they need the education benefits for their children. The conditions are very good in WHO and similar organisations. So there's a huge financial incentive for the people in this industry to keep this train going and to build this agenda. So they will go where the money goes. The money is going to this because people can get money back from it in very large amounts. The wheels are sort of greased by public funding, and the workforce is really dependent on this now.
Thank you. This next one is quite a big question. It's to you, Professor Thakur. You've been a courageous voice speaking out against the issues with COVID response and sounding the alarm over your concerns with the WHO's attempt to rule the world through these treaties, agreements and amendments to the international regulations. Can you please give us a rundown of exactly what these treaties are and the various elements of them that are so problematic.
Okay, that's not quite as easy as it might have been at one point, because these are all in the process of still being negotiated, and multiple drafts are published, updated drafts are published, and some updated drafts are still being discussed privately. They exist, but they haven't been published. So it's hard to know. But they began with major ambit claims. Now, just to put what David said in context, the United Nations is not a unitary actor. It's a coalition, if you like, or several different parts that come together, including specialized agencies, technical bodies, implementing agencies like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which implements the Chemical Weapons Convention, for example. And one of those entities is the WHO, which is meant to be the UN's global health agency. But it has its own governing body, the World Health Assembly, and that's where the decisions will be made. The idea was twofold: to bring up to date the International Health Regulations, IHR, as an existing treaty through amendments, a package of more than 300 amendments altogether, and a new pandemic treaty, which has gone through various iterations, even with regard to its name. The last version that I saw in the published draft, I think, was the Accord, a new pandemic accord. But it's had the various things, and including some strange CA something or other, etc. And they reference each other quite a lot. Now, a new treaty would require a 2/3 approval from the WHA, the World Health Assembly, to be adopted. And then it would need to be ratified through the domestic processes in the various countries. As an existing treaty, the IHR regime requires us a simple majority vote for the amendments to be adopted, and they don't go through the ratification process, because otherwise you'd never be able to amend any treaty that exists. So they're different. The IHR is already legally binding. What the UN system is very good at, and it has a unique capacity, is to set standards for the conduct of states in world affairs. Standards, benchmarks, normative benchmarks, if you like. And that's, in a sense, what it does. It's the WHO that sets the global health standards to which states have agreed to conform. The intent and the stated justification has been to learn from and apply the lessons of COVID. The problem is, I think the WHO's performance in managing COVID was, shall we say, underwhelming. In terms of the burden of disease that David was talking about, let's remember, this is a disease that is so deadly that millions of people need to be tested to realize they have it. And from the start, we've known that the survival rate, if you get it, was around 98%. I mean, you know, one of the side effects, incidentally, of the vaccine is Bell's palsy. I've actually had Bell's palsy long before this era, and I was given a recovery rate of 90%. You know, there's 10% chance that I wouldn't recover from that mini stroke on the facial paralysis sort of thing. That is worrying, 10%. At this age, to say that I might have a 2% chance of death, that doesn't worry me. So I think we have to keep things in perspective. That was one. Then the second problem was, and this is where I came in, and it's actually not very courageous on my part necessarily, because I was already retired. They couldn't quite fire me since I had done my job. But I did have access to the media, even mainstream media, which continued through the period. So I was able to give voice to a lot of concerns, including at the request on and with the communication of information and data to me from people who wanted to speak out, but were not in a position to speak out. The reason I got involved was I was familiar with the WHO report, which summarized a century's worth of experience, evidence, and scientific theories, going back to the Spanish flu, on what works and what to avoid in managing pandemics. That report was published, believe it or not, as recently as September 2019. So just 2 to 4 months before the outbreak of this pandemic. And it has a very nice summary table which says things that are recommended and things that are not. And one of the things that, or several of the things that are not recommended under any circumstances are things that were done. It was the job of the WHO, in my opinion, to have stood against this nonsense. And it's the Swedish state epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, who was, like me, surprised at what various countries were doing. And he said, I looked at what they were doing, I looked at the data on which they were basing their decisions, and to us it didn't make sense either scientifically or in regard to data. So we decided to stick with the existing plan. That was his explanation. So the radical departure was what we did here in Australia, in the United States, in the UK. The status quo decision is what Sweden did. And for that, of course, initially they were demonized, vilified. But by now it is pretty clear that even in the COVID-19 metrics itself, Sweden is no worse than the average European performance. In fact, it's actually somewhat better. And on all the other associated metrics, it's hugely better. So all the cautionary elements of the WHO report from September 2019, which is also inserted into national pandemic preparedness plans. Now, it's a long time since I lived in New Zealand, but I've looked at the Australian plan, I've looked at the American plan, I've looked at the British plan, I've looked at the Canadian plan. All of them reflected that consensus. These things, if you need to do them, do it for 2 to 3 weeks to flatten the curve, meaning so your health system isn't overwhelmed. Use that time to ramp up through a surge capacity your public health defenses, and then get rid of those control measures, because all you do is defer and delay, and you risk a lot of damaging consequences the longer you keep them in place. So that's what got me interested in all this from a public policy point of view. And also bearing in mind that the whole purpose of public policy is to allocate resources that are finite, because your tax base is not infinite. Allocate resources in proportion to the threats and in proportion to the benefits you will get from each dollar spent. Within the health portfolio, how much you want to allocate to this as opposed to other threats? Well, if you're in the developing country, you don't suddenly misdirect all your resources from your big killer diseases like TB, malaria, cholera, HIV/AIDS. Your biggest gains have come in the West and will come in the poor countries from, as David said, improvements in sanitation, nutrition, antibiotics, and important childhood vaccinations. Not an excess of numbers that we seem to be heading down to, but the key ones. And these efforts, early on in the pandemic, food security was threatened. Childhood immunization was threatened. Children's very important educational training and qualifications were threatened. We knew this at the beginning. So all these were ignored. And as I said, I would have liked the WHO to be the world's defenses against insanity based in panic, and the developing world's defenses against imposition of these, because it was a serious issue in Europe and North America, not so much in the developing world for a number of reasons. And whichever way you look at it, even from our point of view in the industrial world, I think the WHO failed us. It failed us in not speaking up for the essential elements of individual autonomy, doctor-patient confidentiality, informed consent, etc. So its performance, I think, needs to be studied before we begin to reform it, so that we know. And the reason for that is, yes, we do need something like the World Health Organization, because we live in an interdependent world. It's a globalized world. It's a major global health public policy challenge, and we need a centralized information clearinghouse, a coordinating agency, an organization through which we can transmit technical expertise and knowledge to countries that don't have them, as well as necessary resources beyond what we need ourselves. Those needs remain, so the reform is important. But first, let's study the lessons correctly, rather than make permanent and entrench a system of command and control, as opposed to a locally driven thing. You know, in my system in Australia, I'm very happy to trust my GP, and if I don't trust my GP, I'll change my GP. But it's not for some bureaucrat or technocrat in Geneva to tell me what my GP should be prescribing me. That person at that remote distance will never have the detailed knowledge of my history or my family's history that my local GP has. And those are the dangers that we face from this service. It's a long answer, but I think we need to understand that they're taking advantage of the unique legitimacy of the name United Nations and taking advantage of the admitted need for a system of global cooperation in order to further their own interests as a corporate international bureaucracy, rather than give priority to the needs of the peoples, which is the reason for which they were set up.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. So from what we've seen of the various iterations of those agreements that are floating around, even though they're not been finalised yet, it's things like lockdowns, being able to order lockdowns,
Vaccine passports
and mandates, readiness sort of measures, surveillance of all sorts of things with respect to viruses and stuff, censorship, is that right? And as well as member state financial.
We don't call it censorship. Countering misinformation and disinformation.
In public health, yeah.
Censorship is what the bad guys do.
Yes, it's a real concern. Katie, this next one's for you. You've been all over this topic like a rash for the past year or so, and probably longer. Can you please give us a summary of the situation with the vote that's set to take place in a few days at the 77th World Health Assembly? Who will be attending? How does it work? Who does it impact? And how has the WHO, W.H.O, broken its own rules? So I know there's quite a few questions in there. You've got it written down somewhere.
As mentioned, there are two treaty documents that are due to be voted on at the end of May at the World Health Assembly. The amendments to the International Health Regulations and the new pandemic agreement, I think it is now. The 194 member states of the World Health Organization will attend in Geneva to vote on these two pandemic treaty reforms. Attending from New Zealand will probably be a Minister of Health maybe, or certainly a public servant that will have the permission, I guess, to vote on these one way or the other. The interesting thing is that we've also got our former Director General of Health.
Hey, come on, this is a night of the realm.
Ashley Bloomfield, who has been negotiating these, particularly the International Health Regulation amendments, as co-chair of the working group. So he will no doubt be there as well, and it will be quite an interesting situation, because if New Zealand, for example, felt the need to postpone the vote or vote no, there is obviously this unusual situation where our former Director General of Health is at the WHO negotiating these documents. So it's, I would say it's a conundrum. It's going to impact all of us. All of these documents will have a direct consequence on us when decisions are made by the Director General of the WHO, and we will have a very different landscape. If you think the last 4 years was tough, the last 4 years looks pretty tame to what's going to be proposed in these documents. The WHO has broken its own rules in a couple of ways too, because it was actually required to deliver the amendments to the international health regulations in January of this year, in accordance with one of its own articles. And it failed to do that. They came up with a legal opinion which was dodgy, and it suggested that, well, you've delivered these back in December 2022 originally, so that's the version that you can say that you delivered. But of course, they'd spent another 2 and a bit years crafting those and reworking them. There had been a, I would say, scathing review committee report on the amendments to the international health regulations. And we've just seen the latest version, I think was 17th of April 2024, and there's a lot of work that's gone into these documents, an awful lot of work. Likewise, the pandemic agreement was due to be delivered, final version, end of March 2024, so that all countries had the opportunity to consider the amendments, the impact on them, before voting. And that's not been allowed to happen. In fact, the versions that we've received in April are still a draft because they've continued to work on them for the last couple of weeks. So it's an atrocious situation for the World Health Organization to be really forcing countries into having to make a decision without having had time to properly consider these documents. And why that is relevant is because even if you do adopt them, or they are adopted, there is an inference that you're going to apply them and comply with them while you go through the process of considering whether or not you're going to implement them. So it's all being done under a huge amount of urgency. They really do need to postpone, and if forced to vote, the vote really should be no.
Thanks, Katie. I think back to the time when we were encouraging people to put in their feedback on that, and they were giving feedback on outdated amendments that had been overridden, but they wouldn't give us.
Yeah, and that was really crazy because you write to the government and you're like, this is an exercise in futility, writing submissions on documents that you know are out of date, and you've probably seen a later version. But you know what? We got 3,000, I think, over 3,000 submissions in for the international health regulations. The pandemic treaty is still open, and that was a very marked difference from the time when they first allowed opportunity for feedback, when I think there was 16 submissions that were submitted back in August last year. So it is a sign that people are talking about these things, and the awareness is increasing because it's so important.
Thank you. Dr. Bell, if you had a magic wand to give our decision makers an instant understanding of the threats before us with respect to the WHO treaties, regulations, and our sovereignty, what would be the most important aspects for them to understand, and why?
Yeah, so it's this issue of pandemic risk that they need to understand. They're dealing with a really small problem. We've seen an increase in reported pandemics since the 1960s because we invented ways to detect them. We couldn't detect Nipah virus before the late 1990s. It doesn't mean Nipah virus suddenly appeared. It's an example. It's in bats throughout Asia and Africa. But it causes an encephalitis, very small outbreaks, they disappear. There's never been an outbreak of more than 110 people dead. So this is something that when it first came out in Malaysia and was recognised, I thought it was Japanese encephalitis. So there's always been small outbreaks, and they go away again, and we didn't know what they were, so we'd attribute them to this or that, or we'd never hear about them because we didn't have digital communications. We didn't even have roads in a lot of places. We've developed all this. Now we can detect a lot of outbreaks, and we detect a lot of viral variants, which are potential cause of outbreaks. And this is a large part of the funding for these agreements is going to detect these variants. That doesn't mean it is an outbreak. It means it's a viral variant, which viruses change in nature. What we're doing is trying to detect nature, and we're getting better and better at detecting nature. What we're then doing is turning that into a pretense that this is a dramatic increase, and we read in WHO and World Bank documents and so on about an existential threat to humanity, or a rapid increase in emergence of new diseases. What we've done is develop the ability to detect diseases. What we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years in the the Gideon database, which is the largest database of outbreaks, is what the World Bank uses in their reports, etc. We see a reduction in the number of outbreaks, a reduction in the mortality from outbreaks. And there's a very good reason for this, because we've got better at detecting them, but we're also getting better at managing health in general, and we're generally getting better nutrition, etc. So the risk that we're dealing with is going away, or is getting smaller. The pandemics were a huge problem 100, 200, 300 years ago. Most of those were bacterial. We don't see them anymore. We don't see big outbreaks of plague because we have antibiotics. Cholera, we know it's due to bad sanitation. We fix that. So we have much bigger issues in health, but what we will do by diverting these resources, and we're talking about $30 to $40 billion a year in funding, which is 10 times what we give to the WHO now. It's an enormous amount of money. What we'll be doing is taking money from the programs that actually matter, that actually help health, and putting them into this essentially a niche area. And people will say, well, what about COVID? Well, COVID arose almost certainly from gain-of-function research. That's very clear now. And this was part of the whole industry around finding viruses, fiddling with them, so that perhaps we can make a vaccine if they get into humans, and inevitably sometimes in doing this, in making a vaccine worse so that we can understand that, they leak out. And there's reportedly now gain-of-function research being done around bird flu, etc. So these are huge risks, and we've seen in COVID what happened. Natural outbreaks are going down, and to deal with unnatural outbreaks where there's human interference, there are very different things needed. And obviously you wouldn't leave that to a bunch of bureaucrats in Geneva who are pushing the agenda that's causing it. I think that the last thing I'll just say, and that they need to understand, is why we live longer now than we used to. And it is, well, we discussed it, we mentioned this, it's because of better nutrition, it's because of antibiotics to some extent, sanitation to a large part, better living conditions. And none of this is in any of these documents. None of it is in any of the funding that's suggested. But what we will see is a reduction in funding for these areas that we know actually matter because of the diversion to this niche area, which really the only major outcome is going to be a concentration of wealth and profits for the pharmaceutical industry and very little else.
Thank you. Same question to you, Professor Thakur. If you had a magic wand to give our decision makers an instant understanding of the threats before us, what would be the most important aspects to have them know?
Understand that the WHO is first and foremost an international bureaucracy, not a collection of the world's leading scientists and medical scientists. As a bureaucracy, they have their own interests. In the public health area in particular, as in so many other areas, the interests of the high-income industrialized countries often diverge from that of the low-income poor countries. In our part of the world, the average age of COVID-related mortality has been at or higher than average life expectancy. So 4 years later, if you take people at that age, most of them have a life expectancy of 6 to 12 months anyway, and especially if they're in care homes, as a lot of these were. Many would have died in any case. But diverting resources away from other priority areas for younger populations and from their educational requirements and from the need to avoid rapid inflation, which burdens them with a debt decades into the future. All those has meant that a few extra months for people my age was stolen from many life years that would have applied to the younger people. That's a crazy world in terms of priorities. That's in our world. In developing countries, on the other hand, as I said, we need to keep improving sanitation, nutrition, childhood immunization. All of these were badly disrupted from supply chain disruptions, from people being locked up at home instead of being allowed to go to school, and screenings and detection were lost. As I said, the food insecurity. So a lot of problems occurred there. The outcomes were bad. We do need to go and look at that. And the failures of the WHO, the extent to which it got captured by different donor interests and private sector in the name of philanthropic foundations or whatever, in fact, actually pursuing their own thing. You should go and look up reputable sources for the increase in net assets of one Mr. Bill Gates from 2019 to 2022. It's several billion, his total assets. So philanthropy can be very profitable. These are important issues, and most importantly, I think political leaders need to accept that it's their responsibility to manage all of public policy, to manage the whole breadth of public health and health. That simply saying I was following the science is no excuse to abdicate on their solemn responsibility and hand over power and decision-making control to the public health bureaucrats. Now, as I said, it's been a long time since I was in New Zealand, but it is certainly not my impression in Australia that the public health bureaucrats were the brightest in the graduating class of the medical school.
Thank you. Yes. Katie, from a legal perspective, how do you view these WHO measures and their potential impact on our way of life here in New Zealand? And how important is it for us to ensure our government conducts a thorough national interest test as promised, resulting in the rejection of these treaties?
The amendments to the international health regulations, as Ramesh said before, are just amendments to the 2005 version, which is already legally binding in New Zealand. What the changes will be a huge implementation process where you'll see these treaties and the requirements of them get implemented into our local legislation or our domestic legislation. And we've got, I think under the International Health Regulation amendments that are proposed, there is a requirement to establish a new body to make sure that we are complying, which we also get to pay for. A pandemic agreement, on the other hand, is an entirely new document, and that's got a whole lot of infrastructure and mechanics in it that we will also have to implement if we adopt. The need to scour our countrysides for pandemic pathogens of pandemic potential, which we will then ship off to a WHO run laboratory where they can conduct all of the things that they want to with those pathogens of pandemic potential, so that they can then come up with the cure. So legally, we've seen a huge number of issues over the last 4 years where cornerstone legal principles were brushed to one side in the name of, and under the guise of fear of COVID. We're going to see that happen, and the excuse for it to happen so much more under these pandemic agreements, and it's a big concern. The national interest assessment or test would likely have already been done on the pandemic agreement in any event. It would be a requirement for that to be reviewed. The national interest assessment is usually done by the Ministry of Finance, so they would definitely be putting a spotlight on the sheer cost of this. I think there's been an estimate that it would be about 5% of our national spend on healthcare, so that's a huge number of people not getting
healthcare that they need here because we are getting, or we're making sure that the WHO is pandemic ready. Not actually responding to a pandemic. The National Interest Assessment will actually have to be conducted on the amendments to the international health regulations as well, under the coalition agreement. And both of those will, hopefully go far enough to have maybe select committee involvement where we actually do get the chance to give public feedback and, have a say on what these documents may mean for us. Because at this point in time, and while we've still only seen the drafts, the impact that these documents are going to have on us are huge. I was terribly encouraged to see a rewrite of one of the cabinet papers in February of this year, and that cabinet paper spelt out as clearly as it could that that New Zealand will not be giving away any of its sovereignty in favour of the WHO or other international organisations. So that was a step in the right direction. It was very different from the cabinet paper that was prepared under Labour, which essentially was written by, I think, some health public servant, possibly sycophant, because they had cited ad nauseum the need for One Health, equity, inclusion, and all of those things that we can now see have been worded slightly differently under the amendments to the international health regulations.
Thank you. Professor Thakur, given your experience of how the UN and WHO operate, what might the consequences be for member states choosing to oppose the WHO treaties?
The most important consequence will be we'll get a better treaty in the end. Postpone it, put it on hold. As I said, investigate the WHO performance, investigate national performance with credible independent review teams with proper terms of reference, not a predetermined outcome exercise that too many countries have gone through, let alone an extraordinarily expensive one that the UK is conducting. And then see where the WHO fits into that and where it fits into the need for allocating resources and attention and effort to pandemics as opposed to other health burdens that we face. So proportionality, allocation of resources proportionate to the threat and proportionate to the benefits we get from each dollar put into that. I don't see any downside to postponement of this because the entire case for rushing it through is built on false premises. Whether it's deliberate and intentional or unintended and ill-informed, I don't know, but it's certainly false premises where they end up simply referencing each other's documents. And the citations, if you follow them, when the specialists follow some of the citations, they discover to their horror that either it's been misrepresented or not enough has been done to establish an accurate analysis of the scale of the problem. So I don't see any downside. The only downside potentially is a loss of momentum for reform, and that can make it more difficult later on to restart it. But I'm very happy to risk that loss of momentum in order to get it right. If it's going to be a generational change and legally binding, as all say it will be, then I want to make very sure that it is right. I think it was bad enough in the COVID years to have national, and in case of federal system, state health bureaucrats and regulators effectively insert themselves between the doctor and the patient. Now, if you're happy to trust your central health bureaucrat more than you trust your doctor, that's fine, that's not a problem. And now we face the additional prospect of a WHO technocrat being also inserted into the doctor-patient relationship. No. I prefer to go the other way around. The trainer doctors, one final thing in relation to that, by the way. I think all this effort into mandates, lockdowns, etc., etc. Governments have succeeded in diverting attention from the fact that, enthralled to the orthodoxy of economic liberalism, perhaps they underfunded and underinvested in the public health infrastructure. If we didn't have an adequate public health capacity to manage this, the fault is more likely to have been domestic than WHO. And the solution is to go back and look at that. So what do we need as adequate capacity in normal circumstances? And can we build in resiliency and a surge capacity? So when things happen, we will cope. So one of the worst things we did in Australia was to close state borders. You have a national health system where people can be moved to where the capacity is to deal with them, regardless of where it occurs. And instead we end up with saying Queensland hospitals are for Queenslanders. And so a pregnant mum carrying twins is denied flight in time to go from Brisbane to Sydney because she's resident on the New South Wales side of the border, and she lost one of the twins. And this is all in the name of even one preventable death is one death too many. That's the level of absurdity to which we had descended. That doesn't need any new treaty to solve that particular problem. So some things we need to look at improving and reforming at the international level. No urgency to that I can see. A lot of false assumptions and premises. And, dare I say it, a lot of misleading statements coming out that they should avoid.
Do you foresee anything along the lines of geopolitical or sort of consequences of bullying that might take place if a member state were to say no to this, in terms of on the international stage?
I think that is exaggerated as a threat. I think the greater worry I would have is that, look, even in the Western world, where it shouldn't happen, we have had two trends that worry me. One is the careerization of politicians, where people make this a full-time occupation, have no real life experience or work experience outside of politics, start in student politics, enter into union or party politics, and then begin as staffers and then take over to replace retiring members. That's one. And the second one is being a centralization of power and decision making in the federal government or in the central government, and within the government in the office of the Prime Minister. We have had extraordinary prosperity, political stability, and social cohesion from the democratic system of governance built around cabinet collegiality and cabinet responsibility, where issues are debated. A good leader always has the self-confidence to appoint as colleagues around the cabinet table competent, independent-minded, powerful colleagues who have responsibility for their portfolios. A bad leader is one who, like in Australia, ends up secretly swearing himself in to another 6 portfolios and acquiring more power. So it's the more people you have around the table with the requisite expertise, the less likely you are to fall into the traps and errors of groupthink and closed-minded decision-making and panicked decision-making. I would never put my faith in a government that reacts in panic to any crisis. But that's what happened. So, as I said, it keeps coming back to we have not yet bothered to learn the right lessons from what happened. Until that is done, I find myself unable to contemplate reforming the entire architecture of global health governance within which national health governance should be nested.
Thank you. Dr. Bell. Thanks, Katie. You've been working on a paper with the University of Leeds published this week called The Cost of Pandemic Preparedness. It looks at the lack of accurate cost estimations for pandemic preparedness at the domestic and international levels, the issues with monitoring and reporting, inadequate and circular evidence, a lack of clear definitions, and disproportionate investment for an unknown disease burden, amongst other things. Can you tell us more about the numbers that are involved in being pandemic ready, and why are they problematic? What's the price tag?
Okay, yeah, and you'd think if you're embarking on legally binding international documents, agreements, treaties, that you would have all this sorted out. And so what's being done at least, it's really old-fashioned public health. It's you looking at the evidence base and just making that accessible, so that people can can see what's going on, make decisions. On the finance side, so there are a number of documents, particularly from the World Bank and the World Health Organization, that attempt to cost the pandemic agenda. So what's in the IHR amendments and the pandemic agreement and some other costs. And they essentially come to about 30 to 40 billion. There's 31.1 billion for the sort of core. That World Bank wants another 10 billion for One Health on top of that, but it's not funded within it. But there are also, in the pandemic agreement, there are surge funding, there's support for private companies, manufacturers, so that they can be ready to make a 100-day vaccine at a moment's notice. This is all public funding that is being required. So the minimum is 30 to 40 billion per year, which is, as mentioned, is 10 times the current budget of the WHO. But over the first 5 years, it comes around to $250 billion. So a large part of this is, a significant part of this is overseas development aid, foreign aid. It comes to about 25 to 50% of current foreign aid, about 50% of 2019 foreign aid. So this is all the money that's given for development. We're talking about this amount of it going into this essentially niche problem. And a significant part, in several billions, is expected to be forked up by low middle income countries as well. So these countries that have huge disease burdens and that are now much more indebted because of what happened in COVID. It had a huge impact on the increase in the reduction in GDP, increase in foreign debt of low income countries, which has made them extremely vulnerable now to the World Bank and the IMF, who are very much behind the pandemic agenda. It's one of the things that makes it very, very difficult for them. You can take out wording on sovereignty, but essentially it's going to be very hard for them to assert sovereignty over this in the future. Yeah, I mean, these are, in a way, they're ridiculous amounts of money. It's very unlikely that this money is going to be available. But the money, that makes it all the more so that the money that is going to be used for this is coming from much more important causes and so on. So I think that, the report you mentioned that was released last week from Leeds, it just tries to lay out this, but it helps to explain what is happening here. So as an example, there's a report which is now unavailable from the World Health Organization 2021, came up with roughly $30 billion for funding. And then the G20 in 2022 comes out with their high-level independent panel report, which has about the same number and references the WHO report as an example of someone getting the same number. And then the WHO revises their report in 2022 and quotes the G20 as evidence that. But this isn't isolated. This is, if you look also in the documents, and the other report we've done is on the burden and the urgency. There's constantly these circular references where someone writes a paper and says, climate change is having a huge burden on increasing outbreaks. And then there's a whole string of papers quoting that original paper, but there was never any evidence in the original paper. And this is, I mean, it's disappointing from a public health point of view to see what is going on, because up to 2020, I was not naive, I think, but I did assume that there was much more rigour. And in the past there was. I mean, when I was in W.H.O, I think we acted with much more rigour, or in the work that I was doing anyway, and I think most work there. Now you read through these reports on both financing and on the pandemic risk, and it's amateurish, but it is also it's extremely self-serving, and it is just, it's just highly inaccurate, and it's hard to put words on it, but it is misinformation on a gross scale, and I think it's deliberate. I think most people in public health, they know that if you impoverish people, they die sooner. If you impoverish countries, more children die. They know that a virus that kills people at an average age, more than the average, more than the age that most people die in terms of life expectancy, that it doesn't make sense then to stop children going to school, to wreck their future education, to stop people working so that they can't pay taxes to support future healthcare. These are just stupid things that happened in COVID. The same things are planned in these agreements. So the reports are just trying to get back to basics, evidence-based public health, and if we do that, then we would not be voting on these agreements clearly. Apart from the legal issue, they're very centralisation of a complex problem, centralisation of control of public health for a complex problem that is completely different in different populations, different age groups, and where populations have very, very different priorities, cultures, etc., is just bad public health. That's why in the past we emphasised community-based control, we emphasised actual diversity, not just the word, in healthcare. And that is what made the big difference in public health. So we're reversing that. It's just, it's an extremely bad way to manage a complex problem.
Thank you. This next one is for Professor Thakur. I have got scribbled out words here on my piece of paper because I don't even want to say this man's title. Sir, crossed out, Ashley Bloomfield, the co-chair of the WHO's working group on the IHR amendments, recently published an article in The Australian about concerns that you have voiced about member countries ceding sovereignty under the pandemic treaty reforms. Unlike Dr. Bell, you have no medical qualifications, but you do have UN experience. What qualifies you to speak on this matter?
Sir Ashley, I will unquestionably defer to his vastly superior medical knowledge compared to my non-existent medical qualifications. If I entered into a debate on the technical side of medical issues with him, I would quickly find myself totally out of depth. I respectfully submit that when it comes to sovereignty concerns, he is equally out of depth compared to my experience and knowledge and qualifications. I was senior advisor on reforms to Kofi Annan as Secretary General in 2002 and the principal writer of his reform report in 2002. That reform report covered not just the UN Secretariat, but the entirety of the UN system, including the WHO. I was a commissioner on the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, where our mandate was to reconcile the highly divisive and bitter and polarizing confrontation between those who believed in humanitarian intervention from the global north and the majority from the global south who saw in sovereignty the final shield against any revival of colonialism or neocolonialism. I was in a small group based in Canada that advocated for an elevation of the G20 finance ministers meeting into leaders level meeting so that they could broker deals on global deadlocks, on pressing global challenges. So yes, I do know something about sovereignty. And indeed, the International Commission report, I was one of the main writers for that as well, where we reconceptualize sovereignty in the language of responsibility of states and citizens becoming rights holders and rights bearers, not privileges of state for sovereignty. It's an old problem. It's a problem and tension that the UN system has grappled with throughout its existence. The balance between global cooperation in pursuit of shared and common goals, whether it is to maximize the public good in terms of cooperation or to mute conflict as an undesirable element. The concerns that many countries have on sovereignty are real and legitimate and need to be addressed. Deflecting it doesn't help. And the problem is, as things stand, we will end up with the worst of all outcomes, in that the WHO will say, if charged with violating sovereignty, no, we didn't. Every state remains sovereign. It's their right to reject or accept. And similarly, all we do is issue advisories and recommendations. And the governments will say, well, we have undertaken to abide by these legally binding recommendations. So if you want to blame someone, blame the WHO for issuing that advisory. And both sides will essentially be exercising power without any responsibility or accountability at that point. So yes, it is unquestionably a loss of sovereign control, in that effective decision-making authority over key health policy decisions is transferred upwards from national governments, where it should belong, to an international bureaucracy where it doesn't belong, as opposed to the bureaucracy being a technical body that advises and collects information and facilitates the exchange of best practices and state-of-the-art knowledge, but doesn't dictate, doesn't tell governments what to do. That is the concern. And in pursuit of that concern, we've had all 49 Republican senators in the United States write formally to the president saying they want the United States to reject these accords. 22 attorneys general have said this writ of the WHO will not run in their states. We've had the UK government say publicly now that they have sovereignty concerns in terms of the WHO saying, for example, pharmaceutical products, including vaccines, that are made in the UK under a pandemic emergency declared by the Director General of the WHO, they can require 10% of those pharmaceutical products, including vaccines, to be given for free by the UK to the WHO, another 10% at cost recovery basis for distribution elsewhere. And the British government saying, no. If this is made in the UK, we will determine as a sovereign government what our priorities are, domestically needs, what our needs are, and if there's any leftover, then we will consider what we can give internationally. And most recently, we've had 14 MPs and senators in Australia write letter of concern formally to the Prime Minister as well. So you're telling me, or Ashley is telling me, that these professional politicians at national level, they don't understand sovereignty concerns? I think I'll stand by my judgment on those issues compared to his.
Good on you. Oh, one more question for you. Here in New Zealand, our traditional media appears to be allergic to touching this topic. We invited them along today to our press conference, and of course none of them turned up. We have commentators, experts and authorities saying that these treaties and regulations will not remove our sovereignty, and that to say otherwise is to engage in conspiracy theories. What is your message to these people?
The difference between conspiracy theory and truth is about 6 months these days, I think. 2 months, says Kate. I did an article for the Brownstone Institute, I think, the title of which was, "What we have experienced is a pandemic of journalistic malfeasance." The media lost its inquisitiveness and curiosity. It's lost its ability to do its job. It's a combination of cutbacks and training and change of ethos, and becoming increasingly dependent on government direct largesse or advertising revenue, and fearing control, is the growth of the censorship industrial complex as well, where broadcast regulators have become overly and overtly politicized rather than ensuring standards of impartiality across the board. And the idea that journalists would stop, the title of my book, Our Enemy, the Government, it comes from a conversation with a veteran journalist in Australia who said journalists should abide by the maxim that politicians lie for a living. You might have guessed that I have an Indian background. Many of you might be aware of the reality that in the last few years, India has been the fastest growing major economy in the world. You may not know the secret to that, at least what many of my fellow Indians say back in India. The Indian economy grows mainly during the night when the government is asleep. That's when it can do least damage to impede the growth of the economy, create bottlenecks, and let the consumer and the producers field each other's demands and needs and products. So there is a reality to that. And COVID became immensely profitable to governments in the expansion and abuse of state power, but it was also immensely profitable to legacy media in terms of clickbaits and eyeballs. But the long-term damage to the profession is now being mapped in poll after poll in so many countries with respect to the falling trust, the falling viewership and readership. It used to be the case that I won't believe this until it has been officially denied in the pages of the New York Times. Well, now, who do you trust? And that's a very high price to pay long term for the media. And the growth of institutions like Reality Check Radio, like alternative media, why have they attracted such a big following? There never would have been a niche market for them if the mainstream media had done its job properly.
That's right.
And interrogated governments instead of acting as propaganda pieces for ministerial handouts.
Thank you. Okay, last question before we get into our Q&A. This is for everybody. Imagine you're one of the audience members here tonight and you're out and about tomorrow, standing at the supermarket checkout, waiting for your groceries to be processed. What soundbite on this topic do you open with to spark up a discussion with the checkout operator and the person behind you in the queue? Katie, can you go first?
This is the conversation I have every time I go to the supermarket. Poor Otis now closes the checkout counter whenever I turn up. My question usually is have you heard about the new pandemic treaties that the W.H.O is drafting? And really that's where it starts, and I then get shuffled out the shop pretty quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Bell.
I'm not sure. I think I would ask them whether they've checked in with Geneva to assure themselves that those groceries are good for them.
Professor Thakur.
You know, in the 1950s, this is true, by the way, it's not a made-up story. In the 1950s, they did a survey in India to try and find out what proportion of the population was aware that the British had left. For those of you who are not aware of it, independence year was 1947, okay? That survey had to be aborted because the most common response was, when did the British come? So I think I spark a conversation if someone asks me what I did in my, as a retired person, as a retiree, what did I used to do? If I don't want to have a conversation, I mention the university, and that kills the conversation. If I want to spark some interest, I say I used to work for the United Nations. And that can lead to a lot of very interesting conversations. Mostly warmly supportive, some intensely critical, but interesting exchanges. You know, my former Vice-Chancellor at the ANU when I was there was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And he said when he traveled in flights, long flights, if he didn't want to have a conversation with the person in the neighboring seat, and they asked him what he did, he would say, he's an astrophysicist. If he was open to conversation, his answer would be, I'm an astrologer.
Lovely, thank you. Before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our three amazing guests tonight. None of us thought that this would be where we are with our lives, and yet here you are, travelling around the world, away from your families, sharing your insights, knowledge, and experience in the hope that it makes a difference in the world and eventually tips the scales in our favour. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to express our gratitude for your patience, thoughtfulness, and generosity in sharing your time and messages tonight. So I think we might be one mic down because we're all right? Okay. So we'll go to the audience questions. Now, obviously, we have got limited time for this segment, so please spare Tane and Natalie the embarrassment of having to yank away the microphone from long, rambling statements, and limit things to brief questions only, please. So where's our roving mic? Have we got? Oh, Tane's down the back. Okay.
I believe the elite are controlling WHO, and I think Bill Gates owns about 40% of the shares at least. But he's only one of the elite. The others, like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and a lot of other elite, 300 families or something in the world, something like that. Why did they allow this lockdown to happen? They would have known the truth with their information and their sources. They could have fought Bill Gates. Because I believe, so what I'm asking is, how can one man like that, because the elite will definitely, I don't believe they're all united. I bet there's what do you call it, dissension between them. So how did one man get his way?
I think the answer is it's not one man. This is a movement, it's a corporate authoritarian movement. The World Economic Forum is an example. We live in a world where there are large investment houses like BlackRock and Vanguard. The biggest shareholders in Pfizer and AstraZeneca and in major media corporations like the New York Times and in food companies and so on. So we're not living in the world that we thought we did. We're living in a world that is very, very strongly controlled by finance and large corporations. And if you have all these assets and you want to make even more money, then you use those assets, and you will use, sick people need more medicine, so you sell more medicine. If you can instill fear in a population and mandate a vaccine, you're guaranteed huge profits. So, you can look at this from a purely business point of view. I'm not suggesting it is that. I think there's a deeper problem here as well. But it's really, it's not the first time public health has been used like this. If you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, the eugenics era and European fascism and technocracy movement, a lot of the messaging was very similar, and there was a very similar use by very wealthy and politically interested people in the use of fear and so on from a public health point of view. So I think there's not, so it's not useful also to concentrate on personalities. I think we have to recognise that this is a societal problem that is very deep. It's driven partly by financial inequality, which we've allowed to happen over the last several decades. It's driven by us allowing we try to save money by having drug companies fund our regulatory agencies. It's an extremely stupid thing to do. It's cheaper, you save some taxes for a few years, and then suddenly you're in the state we're in now, where the people who work for the regulatory agencies know full well where the salaries come from. So they're not going to put their own salaries at risk. We're seeing the extreme case now with the pandemic thing, but I think pushing it onto one person isn't, we as a society have allowed that one person or those few people to have so much influence, and I think we have to look at that.
Thank you.
Hello. I've got a question. I'm not quite sure who I should address it to, maybe Dr. Thakur or you, Katie, but I'm assuming, and because the comment's just been made, you talked about, Dr. Bell, you talked about eugenics. Now, there are many people here, I know, I don't want to be presumptuous, but there are many people here who realise that what's going on is very, very deliberate, and there is a Dr. E. Martin and others who have very clearly shown that this is genocide underway, very clearly, and it may sound like a conspiracy theory, but in 2 months' time it'll be true. I would like to, first of all, know what your opinions are on this, the events of the last 4 years, and very well beforehand. And also, based on the fact that we already have legal obligations to the 2005 IHR, what can we do about that? And really, what can we do about this? So, slightly long question, but they're all related.
Genocide is a very precise term in international law. The definition is contained in the Genocide Convention from 1948. I don't think what has happened in the regard to in the last 4 years, assuming that's what you're referring to, would satisfy any of the conditions to meet the definition of genocide. And I think we do the cause of resisting the building power grabs, damage by distracting the conversation into arguments that are easily countered and refuted. So I think we need to be a bit careful of that. I'm far from being convinced that it was a deliberate effort even at depopulation or culling populations in this instance. I think it was more a panicked response to a manufactured crisis. You are welcome to disagree, by all means. I just don't think the world has the capacity to engage in a coordinated, sustained conspiracy at this level. And nor would it explain why it was possible for some, like Sweden or like Florida and some others in the States, to escape it. And they haven't suffered any adverse consequences from that.
I agree. I mean, there are things that we can talk about here which are absolutely provable, which should be seen as extreme examples of why we need to fix this. The mRNA vaccinations, they had not been used en masse in humans before. There are animal trials that were not very successful. For the BioNTech animal trials, which were released by the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia, there was very strong evidence of an increase in fetal abnormalities in the rats that were injected versus the control rats that weren't injected in about, I think it's 11 different parameters that they looked for fetal abnormalities. They reduced implantation in pregnancy. They didn't do carcinogenicity studies. Most of the studies which you normally do, and which were required for a genetic therapeutic, which is what they were, they reclassed it as a vaccine, which allowed them to get away with that. So then they recommended them for pregnant women, they recommended them for young children, etc., with an absence of data on safety in those populations. Good trial data, but with the knowledge that the risk was very small. So I think that is highly reckless, and we now see all-cause mortality rising. I think that's multifactorial. So there's a lot of theoretical reasons and indication from VAERS, etc., from the databases that suggest there is a strong association with vaccination. There are also the lockdowns, which we knew would increase mortality through a wide number of reasons. I think they're the same. They weren't trying to kill people, but they instituted measures that they knew would increase mortality in the medium long term. So I think we're seeing a complete lack of, we're seeing a reckless approach to health and a lack of rigour. And I think the reason for that is very much profit-driven. Profit is, money is power, power is money. So it's not just the money, it's the power over and to control people so that you can increase their monetisation in the future. And I think you can show that that has happened. If you take it further than that, you start to speculate, but I don't think you need to, because what I've just explained is far more than enough, I think, to stop this train in its tracks.
Just to add to and reinforce what David just said, I think it's challenging enough, from my point of view, to stick to the agenda of holding individual decision makers at the highest level criminally accountable for actions that were at best negligent. And the idea that you'd exempt the pharmaceuticals from any liability, privatize profits, and socialize all the risks. Why were they doing that? And we need to, as I said, I'm not prepared to forgive. I want my sense of justice appeased. And my sense of justice will not be appeased until they are in the dock. And since I'm not a Christian, I can say that.
I think we've got one down the back.
Yeah, okay. So my question is, are not the UN and the WHO so compromised and indeed corrupt that they are beyond saving and therefore any chance of reform?
There's a powerful argument to be made to that effect. I think organizations that have been around for this long acquire and accumulate incredible vested interests that possibly have become impossible to shift and realign. The most important item on the UN reform is that of Security Council reform. And it's so challenging and so difficult that we engage in all sorts of incremental reforms, which is tantamount to rearranging the decks on the Titanic. So yes, there is an argument to be made to that. Indeed, in a conference in Auckland, not last year but the year before, I floated the prospect of, if we conclude that the Security Council reform is not possible, then it's better to reconvene another equivalent of a San Francisco conference for United Nations 2.0 than to waste further time in this endless reform of minor things that make no difference, because that provides an alibi for continuing with an organization that is no longer fit for purpose. So you're not going to get any objection to that from me. And maybe the WHO might also be there, but on this I know David is a lot more radical than I am, so I'll give it to him.
I think it's difficult. I think it's useful to have international organisations that act when countries specifically ask them to, and that cannot be directive. They're a place where people can meet, share information, and that all makes sense. Clearly, the WHO needs reform. There are to do that, you would have to take some very entrenched sort of practices and people, really, out of the mix. And I don't know whether you can do that. It would need an extremely powerful reforming head of the WHO with a lot of people behind them. So I think, perhaps you can reform it. Perhaps we need to have another organisation and transfer some of the good work that the WHO does to that organisation? It's a difficult one to answer, but I don't think you can say they are beyond reform. Nothing is beyond reform, but it is going to be an extremely difficult process because of this way that they're structured now, and particularly with the conflicts of interest that are involved.
Hello. Further to that question, really, previously in the conversation it was very clear that local areas, countries, regions have their own context and need to make their own decisions on where to use their resources in a democratic fashion. I say again, do we need to centralise any of this to these world organisations?
I say we don't need to centralise decision making. It's useful to centralise information so that it's more accessible, but certainly not decision making. But I'll pass to Ramesh.
No, exactly right. We have covered this. So it's what is appropriately done at the local level, and what is it that cannot be done at the local level, but would be helpful to have some coordination, some central clearinghouse, information gathering, best practice sharing arrangements on a voluntary basis, because expertise and resources are not always matched to where the threats and the needs arise. And in an interdependent world, it is true that threats can very quickly cross borders. So yes, it does remain true that problems without passports will require some solution without passports, but that doesn't absolve national governments and state governments and local authorities from responsibilities appropriate to their level that's better handled at the lower level. Rather than begin at the top and then come downwards, let's begin locally, and where we need to, we can then move upwards to different levels. And there is a need for some international mechanisms there, but not, as David said, not centralized decision making, certainly not an authority that can direct governments as to what they should be doing.
I'll be interested to hear from you what you would suggest, and you may well have seen it working somewhere around the world, that we could be doing as a form of action. It's been great to get a lot of information from you, but what would you suggest that we could be doing as a real spearheaded action in the short 10 days to prevent our country and to publicise these issues? And what would be you can't just have loads of issues you can be talking about. What would be like 3 key issues that you would suggest that we could really push, and what would be the best way to get some action in this short time that you would suggest?
Most importantly, just contact all your MPs, every one of you, and encourage friends to contact them. Just say, we need to study this much more carefully, put the whole process on hold, vote to delay it. It's very complex, very challenging, but also very consequential in the impact it's going to have for the next generation. Let's get it right, rather than let's rush it through.
Thank you. Come on, Jodie.
Hello, Jodie Branney. A democracy is dependent on fairness. It is dependent on a proportionate response to any emergency. It's dependent on not being arbitrary in their actions, government ministers, all the way down to staff. So this is a yes-no question for each of you, because I believe that you've looked at these documents. And it's for the people sitting at dinner tables with children and young people in their teens, in their 20s and 30s, because, of course, in this last pandemic, they were required to acquiesce to gene therapy that hadn't gone through cancer testing or genotoxicity testing. So I want to understand if in any of these documents you have seen any discussion on whether in a future pandemic they will consider age stratified risk, and they will consider multimorbidity which were absolute sort of absolute needs for what would put people at risk. So I want to know, yes or no, was this in any of those documents, so that we can be assured that in the next pandemic they will understand whether our children will be treated the same as an 80 or 90-year-old?
No.
Well, that's right. Yeah, there's no such wording. The intent clearly is essentially the same sort of paradigm of you find a threat, you lock people down, and then you do mass vaccination. And we knew in 2019 that this is a really bad idea, but going forward, that's where public health is going. So it's still a really bad idea for exactly the same reasons. The evidence hasn't changed.
I would say it's a very emphatic no. Look, one of the biggest lies they all promulgated during the COVID years was the statement, we are all in this together. We knew from the very beginning that it was almost a uniquely age-stratified risk profile. All the hard evidence showed that. But they couldn't say that, and instead they pushed this line, we are all in this together, meaning everyone is equally at risk. But it's complete rubbish. It was a deliberate lie. Now, whether the source of that lie was their medical officers, who gave them the wrong information, and the politicians were too incompetent and too ignorant to know what the reality was, or whether the politician was doing that, regardless of accurate profiles from that we don't know. But no, that was a deliberate lie, which was necessary for them to be able to get away with what they're doing. And now that it's coming out, they're all too busy pretending it was someone else's fault. And another example, in January, I think, Tony Fauci finally admitted that there was no scientific basis to the 2-meter or 6-foot social distancing rule. And just this week, Francis Collins, the director of the National Institute of Health, has admitted to the same thing. He admitted it to Congress in a secret testimony, but that transcript has just been released within the last couple of days as well. So they were just making it up on the fly and imposing restrictions on us. All that needs to be, that's why I want them in the dock.
We're at time, so maybe we can do this last one, and then that will be it. I'm sorry, people, we've run out.
Is it me or someone else?
Yeah, I think, well, you've got the mic.
Okay. At least in the short term, because of the moral decline in our society and lack of integrity, how do you see as individual families can defend themselves against this sort of situation we face at the moment?
It's hard to give a short answer to that. Let me just put it this way. The only reason I got involved in this and have stayed engaged in this, having chosen to retire earlier than I had to enjoy life retirement, is for the sake of the next generation. Includes my children, includes my grandchildren. And we need to have proper procedures and structures in place so that we maximize the chances of good policy decisions, good policy outcomes, not just in health but across the board. And I accept it as part of my obligations to try and speak out and take the abuse and vitriol that comes with it. Because I know I'm in the very fortunate and privileged position that at the end of the day, there's not much harm they can cause me at this stage in my life. So I do it. But it's not that everyone can repeat what I'm doing, but I would like everyone in this room to be able to do what they can do within their limitations to protect the future of the next generation, starting with the families, but not limited to our immediate families.
If I can just say something on that as well. I think you bring up a really important point on integrity, and we now expect the media to lie, we expect politicians to lie, we now expect public health authorities, unfortunately, to lie. And I think, to answer your question very briefly, I think the best thing that we can do is tell the truth and insist that we are told the truth and hold people accountable when they lie to us. So everything that we're seeing is based on fallacies and falsehoods. And the way to stop that, the way to stop fascism, in fact, is to insist on the truth, because it relies on lies to be sustainable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I see there were so many hands up, but we just can't get to everyone tonight. Sorry about that. To wrap up, a wise guest on RCR last year with Paul Brennan's Fergus O'Connor said, "Our community doesn't have an information problem, we have a communication problem." Our speakers have shared a lot of information here tonight, and it's now up to us to identify some juicy sound bites from what we've heard and pop them into our bag of goodies to share with others as we go about our lives. Remember, gentle watering of the seeds is preferable to a full-force fire hose assault. Let's give one last big round of applause for our three incredible speakers. And also to all of the team that have helped make this evening possible, all the volunteers and the RCR team who have laid out the chairs and put everything together here. It's been a really amazing job. Thank you.